Hello and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman. This week, I'm talking to Dr. Douglas Egerton, whose new book, Heirs of an Honored Name, The Decline of the Addams Family and the Rise of Modern America, looks at an American political dynasty that seems to be going down as modern America is emerging. Don't let that fool you, though. There are a ton of fascinating stories in this massive and very intelligent and intriguing family that sort of has to grapple with changes that are happening, like we all do, in the modernization of America. This podcast has a ton of great anecdotes and some great suggestions for you historians and fans of American history out there. As always, more content, links to additional books, and all sorts of other podcasts are available at hourofhistory.com. Thanks so much for listening on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, the Hour of History blog, and more, head over to hourofhistory.com. For book recommendations about topics mentioned during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, the Hour of History starts right now.
So it's such a pleasure to have you, Dr. Douglas Egerton, on the show. Your new book, Heirs of an Honored Name, The Decline of the Addams Family and the Rise of Modern America, is out now, and it's a fun read. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. And first of all, it's good to be on. Thanks for asking. I write about the essentially where race and public policy kind of connect, and most of my books tend to lead to the next. And so this is actually my ninth solo book. I got my PhD in 1985 from Georgetown, and I mostly taught at Moyne College in Syracuse ever since, with occasional guest positions at Cornell and Colgate and Dublin. That was there on Fulbright. That was fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of amazing to hear of such an accomplished record, and you've won awards for your other books. I'm sure historians who are tuning into the show are familiar. What sort of path did you take that led you to the Addamses?
Well, like I said a moment ago, most of my books tend to lead to the next. That's not usually intentional, but I'll get done with the book and I'll think, there's really more I want to say about this, and I was limited by space or something by the focus of the previous book. And so my last book, called Thunder at the Gates, about the three pioneering Black Civil War regiments from Massachusetts, and of course they all had white officers. And so I followed in that book 10 Black soldiers and 4 white officers. And one of them was Charles Francis Adams Jr., the son of the diplomat. And I was vaguely aware that Charles Francis Jr., before that book existed, but not much about him. And found it fascinating and not used in a very good way. But his correspondence was with his family, with his brothers, was really interesting. And so I thought, there's really more here that one can write about. And really the third and fourth generation, and that's the focus of my book. So the book opens with the death of John Quincy Adams in 1848 in Washington, which is where most books on the Adamses end. And those generations really hadn't been covered. I mean, Henry, of course, the son of the fourth generation, gets a lot of attention because of his novels and his works of history. But the rest are pretty much ignored. And I thought there was a really fascinating story here about what at the time was not just America's first political dynasty, but at the time really was America's only political dynasty. And I thought, these two generations have been pretty much ignored by history. The last book on Charles Francis Sr. was way back in the 1960s. And he played just a pivotal role in helping to keep Britain out of the war on the side of the Confederacy. So there was a great story to be told there.
And it's fascinating hearing the generations sort of cascade down. We are now learning more and more scientifically that what happens generations ago still impacts the sort of present generation. So these sort of generational studies are of very high interest. Adams seems to have a lot written about him. As you mentioned, most works end then in 1848. Did you find that challenging to pick it up there, or did you find that there was a lot of material for you to work with?
No, I didn't. In some ways, it was quite liberating, because when you write about a topic that's been done before, and I try not to do that, you're always then kind of pushing back or engaging with already existing historiography. And so here I didn't have much to deal with. I mean, there are biographies of Charles Francis Jr., Henry Brooks, who was the fourth son, and of course Henry himself. And I should clarify here: Henry Brooks goes by Brooks, and then Henry goes by Henry. But those are all fairly old books, and so to a certain extent, I got to kind of chart my own course by not really having to kind of wrestle with older points of view. And the documentation was just enormous. For the first time, I really had the problem of finding way too many sources. I mean, they all kept diaries. They wrote endless letters, and of course, during the war years, they were usually separated. John Quincy II was up in Massachusetts. The eldest child, Louisa Catherine Adams, was roaming around Europe trying to escape an unhappy marriage. Charles Francis Jr. was with his soldiers. Brooks was a boy and with dad in England, and Henry was too. So between the letters, the diaries, the official documents, every time in late life they gave a speech, they published it as a pamphlet. Henry, of course, wrote a lot, and in many ways kind of really pioneered the study of early American history using a deep dive into documents. And they were so quotable. So I'd be reading their diary, and I'd think, and all the diaries, by the way, are on microfilm, which is really quite nice. I'd be reading those, and I'd think, well, this is a great quote, I could use this. And then 2 pages later, this is a great quote, I can use this. And then this is a great quote also. And I did, in fact, exceed my word count. But I mean, the book grew to the point that I just had to stop using some of these documents. And so the stack of documents that I did not use is about as high as the stack of documents that I did use. And so I'm not sure when they slept. They just wrote all the time.
It is such a rich resource for historians to have, and I kind of laugh because this is a question that I've always asked my students is, we have these historians who have worked on these diaries and resources that have, they were so detailed, and what do we have today? I mean, where is the Twitter record? Is that really going to exist and be good enough for a biography? That's fascinating.
Yeah, certainly, the emails will be vanished in many cases. And, no, they were really good about keeping documentation, and with the exception of Louisa, known as Sister Lou, who had dreadful handwriting. They all had pretty good handwriting and are pretty easy to read. At one point, when Charles Francis Sr. was in England and his daughter Louisa wrote him, and he wrote back and said, I really can't read your handwriting. Can you please work on it? I thought, yes, I appreciate that too.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the sort of the culture of the family and just, I mean, we're talking a lot of Harvard here in these lines, and just what were the sort of, I guess you would say, family values here with the Adamses?
Well, this is one of the things I have a hard time with in the book, because in some ways they're so admirable. They believe in public service. They're just incredibly diligent. They're hardworking, up early, write the diary, read the Bible. They're deeply industrious people. And they're essentially on the right side of history. I mean, they're anti-slavery, they're free soilers. They're also dislikable, petty, competitive, nasty to one another, usually nasty to their spouses, rather bad parents. And one of the things I found really depressing is that they couldn't seem to break that cycle. When Charles Francis Sr. was a boy, he was with his father, John Quincy, in Russia. And later wrote and said, I just never connected with my father. He was cold, he was distant. He knew his mother, but not his father. And he said, John Quincy was just not an easy man to like. And then in his autobiography, Charles Francis Jr. said exactly the same thing about Charles Francis Sr. and said he was cold and distant. So they're all aware of their kind of flaws as humans, as parents, as spouses, but they can't seem to break that. A lot of alcoholism in the family. John Quincy's 2 oldest boys, George Washington Adams and John Adams, both died young. died essentially because of drinking. In fact, reading George Washington Adams's diary was incredibly sad. He was trying to practice law in Boston, and he would stay up late tonight and drink. So he'd write in his diary the next morning, okay, today I'm going to be sober, I'm going to be industrious, I'll get things done, I'll get to bed at a decent time, tomorrow I'll be at the office, and then the cycle, of course, would repeat. And of course, he finally commits suicide. So yeah, they're driven, but they were hard to be around. You know, when you write about somebody, you're around them a lot for quite a few years, and being around them a lot it kind of wore me down.
It's
Let me give you one quick story, and then I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go for it. Let's hear the story.
When Henry writes his first book of history, it's a biography of Albert Gallatin. Gallatin was Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, who was born in Switzerland, and it's a pioneering book. It's not a very good book. It's kind of a cut and paste. There's a lot of Gallatin's letters in it in French, and Henry doesn't translate them, as if you can't read French, don't buy my book. And it's not a very good book, and it gets the scathing, awful review in The Nation, which of course was a big journal at the time. The kind of review that would have anybody just hanging their head in shame. And it's anonymous, but Henry knows immediately it's his brother Charles. I mean, who does that?
People who are taught to be very critical, I guess, very cold, right?
Yeah.
And now, and that kind of leads into what I was thinking earlier. Now, you make a decision to start it. Every historian struggles with this. Where do I start this story? And it's a family story, which we can really, presumably, especially with Adams, take quite far back. How do you get at sort of this puritanical underpinning, even though we're quite removed from the first sort of Puritan Adamses?
Well, that's still a part. I mean, even by the dawn of the 19th century, when the kind of hard old New England Calvinism of predestination is gone, I mean, the basic Calvinist ethic is still there. And at one point, way back, John Adams, Abigail said to him one time, you're hard to be around, and our guests come over, you just stare at them, and try to say something pleasant. And John's response was, well, I'm a Calvinist. It's kind of what we do. We're not cheerful people. And so, of course, that kind of gets passed down from one generation to the next. And one of the things that I think doesn't really help much when it comes to George Washington Adams and John Adams II is that when their father, John Quincy, goes first to Russia, then to France, then to Britain, he's gone for a very long time. Abigail, who's still running the show, and Quincy announces that they will stay with her while the youngest child, Charles Francis Percy, becomes senior, can go with his parents, and they're gone for years, and the kids are terrified of Louisa. And when Charles Francis gets back, and he's still a boy, he writes in his diary, he was like 12, why they're so scared of her. And then a week later he writes, she's a terrifying person. So that, it just gets passed from one generation to the next, and there's something really sad about that.
Yeah, it's so there's definitely, I mean, you've already hit us with some really hard things that can affect a family: alcoholism, distance, success and failure too. Can you also sort of clue us in a little bit to how they're interacting with what's going on? Anyone who is listening, so their ears probably perked up around 1848. There's a whole lot happening in the United States, the Mexican-American War, the soon-to-be Civil War, and you do parallel the book with America. So how do these two things kind of intertwine throughout?
Well, that's a great question, and I hope I did this well. So one of the things I tried to do was both tell a family story, because it is very much an American story, but also to tell them the larger story of what's going on in the background of the nation. And the older book, the one I mentioned that goes back to the 1960s about Charles Francis Sr., essentially never mentions the fact that he has a family. It's just kind of a public man biography, which is common in those days. But there's other books simply about the Adamses as a family, in which you basically wouldn't know that Charles Francis is Lincoln and then Andrew Johnson's ambassador in England for 7 years. So I try to kind of pull the two together and indicate how they they have a huge impact on America, and then how America has an impact on them. And if there's, I guess, core to the book, it's Charles Francis Sr., born in 1807, died in the late 19th century, 1886. So as a young progressive, he's what's known as a conscience Whig. The conscience Whigs were the anti-slavery northern element of the Whig Party. Serves in the state assembly. Does amazing things. One of the stories I found fascinating is way back in the 1790s, as slavery was collapsing in Massachusetts, and there was never much, but it was legal. The state passes a law banning interracial marriage. And Adams regarded that as being what he called a vestige of slavery. And he wants to repeal it. And that was like same-sex marriage was 20 years ago, just kind of a hot political potato nobody wants to go near. And he spent 3 years putting a coalition together, and it would pass 1 year in the State House, fail in the Senate, vice versa. And he finally gets it done. So he really changes the face of the state in many ways. But then, punchline here, being an Adams, he writes in his diary that night, he says, "Today I killed the last vestige of slavery in Massachusetts." And then he says, "But I hope it never happens."
No.
Interracial marriage. And of course it does. It doesn't know any African-American dock workers and Irish tavern women in Boston. But the point is, he does have a real impact. And then, of course, 1848, he becomes the Free Soil vice presidential nominee. And that's, of course, a nod to his father, who just died that year. Is an early Republican. In fact, he becomes a Republican before Lincoln and Seward finally give up on the Whig Party. So he's kind of a founding member of the Republican Party, and is serving in Congress during the secession winter, and is part of the committee to try to work out some kind of compromise solution to slow down secession and seduce the Lower South back into the nation. And fails, of course, at that. Not his fault. And then is tapped by Lincoln to be the third Adams to be minister, we would now call him ambassador, to Britain, and is there, in fact, longer than his father and grandfather were in England combined. So he's there for 7 years. So this is a family that has a real impact on America, but then has an impact on them as well.
And so this idea of them being a political dynasty, though, it is never going to be 3 presidents. I mean, he gets really close, but
Really close.
Yeah, is there sort of like a counterfactual that's worth exploring here?
And I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? If that sort of thing had happened, or just 1 or 2 things had happened differently?
Well, I mean, setting up the scenario is, of all the early American presidents, only John Adams and then John Quincy have a son who lives to adulthood. Everyone else either doesn't have children, they have a son like James Monroe who dies as a child. So it's John Quincy and Martin Van Buren who actually have sons who kind of get into politics. So because they are basically America's first family, whenever there's an opening for, you name it, state assemblyman, governor, dog catcher, there's some editor saying it's got to be an Adams. And when Adams, Charles Francis, does run for the State House, it's mentioned in papers in California and Hawaii because he's an Adams. And so there's kind of always in the news. But part of the family's problem is that they still hold on to an earlier sense of political culture. I mean, back in 1824, when John Quincy was finally chosen in this kind of divisive election to be president, they still have this tradition where a delegation goes and knocks on your door and says, "Surprise, we've just chosen you president," and you have some prepared remarks to be made. But you don't seek the office out. And it's very clear to me from his diary that Charles Francis Sr., really wanted to be the third President Adams, but was not going to politic for it. And probably in 1968, he's not going to get it anyway, only because everybody wants Grant. And after the death of Lincoln and the Andrew Johnson debacle presidency, everybody wants Grant. But Adams did have a chance to become Secretary of State, which in those days was the stepping stone. And this is kind of hilarious scene in the book where Grant actually does tour New England, and he and Adams have this kind of public dinner. And of course, all the journalists there are saying, well, this is kind of their moment to decide, kind of feel each other out. And Adams is just not going to make the first move. He spends most of the evening kind of staring at Grant. And Grant's not going to do that. He's in charge. he's happy to have Adams in the cabinet, but not kind of as the premier. And so then chooses a non-entity instead to replace Adams. So had Adams made any kind of pitch, to be Secretary of State, starting in '69, he might have been in a very good position in 1872, because a lot of the party, Charles Sumner, were very unhappy with Grant and the creeping corruption in his presidency. So, and in fact, in '72, there was kind of a breakaway. It's called the Liberal Republicans. And Henry and Charles Jr. are very much involved in that and kind of politicking on Dad's behalf. But he writes a letter to the convention and says basically it has to be unanimous, it has to come to me, and by the 1870s, that kind of Hamlet attitude just doesn't work in American politics anymore. So kind of part of what does them in is they still adhere to the culture of John and John Quincy back in the kind of the dawn of the Republic.
And do you find this to be a theme that is largely applicable? I mean, you've written 9 books. You've talked a lot about American history. This sort of looking at using the old playbook and kind of slowly becoming irrelevant, or is this just certain political dynasties that aren't able to adapt?
Well, I think both. And one of my books was about the election of 1860, Lincoln's election, of course. And Lincoln was just a deeply ambitious guy. I mean, he really wanted to be actually a senator, but he ran hard. And whereas the Adamses are still using kind of an older model, and after the antebellum age of Jackson, that kind of behavior just is not going to work. I mean, people who want to run you and run under you on a ticket, want to know that you're all in. They just kind of couldn't figure out where Adams was. So part of it was, the country had changed in a way they didn't like, and they saw themselves, of course, as they were the best men, that the most qualified. And they were. I mean, Adams again was just brilliant. Foreign policy, domestic policy, but the country wanted to see that he was serious, and he wouldn't reveal that part of himself, to the party.
And so we continue along with these vignettes and stories that you're drawing from the rich sort of recollections of each of these members of the Adams family. One of the themes throughout is this sort of global nature to the family. I mean, they're all over the place. How does that play into the sort of identity they have, or American identity even?
Well, I think, if you today, if you go abroad, one of the things that kind of puts you, kind of gives you some perspective on being an American is not to be in America, to be outside the country. And that's why my eldest daughter lives in Britain, so I'm there quite a bit. Explaining American politics, they're trying to explain Brexit to me, that kind of thing. So the fact the Adamses are gone quite often, and again, Charles Francis is in Britain for 7 years. Henry is with him as a secretary. Brooks is there because he's young. The daughter, Mary Gardner, who's kind of the one normal person in the 4th generation, is there too. So it allows them to kind of reflect on what it means to be an American. And Charles Francis Sr. has a very keen sense of the flaws in British society. The wealthy landed Tories don't like America because it sees America as this kind of rugged democracy, upstart nation. In fact, one of the things that makes Adams such a great diplomat is because he is a great politician, and he understands when he gets to Britain who's on the side of the North, who's not on the side of the North. Every time a working class union group from Manchester comes to present a petition saying we're on your side, we're for emancipation, he publicizes that all across Britain, gets the news back to the U.S. Despite being, and of course, Charles Francis essentially is raised. He lives in Russia, he lives in Paris during Napoleon's 100 Days. He then lives in Britain. So he's out of the country a lot. And then, of course, Louisa Catherine, the oldest daughter of Generation 4, spends most of her life unhappily kind of wandering around Europe, and dies in Florence, just outside of Florence. She was driving a carriage too fast and rolls the carriage. And this is 1870, crushes her leg, and she refuses to have it amputated. And Henry gets there in time to say goodbye to her. But she dies in Florence, and she's buried in so-called the English cemetery. And for a while, they lost her grave. It fell over. The whole graveyard is kind of a mess. And they finally found it, and it's leaning against a wall. So there's a photograph in the book. My wife got her hand and her cell phone in behind and got a picture of what is the name. But yeah, they're out of the U.S. a lot. And of course, Henry and Brooks are deeply enamored of Europe in the Middle Ages. And Henry, of course, writes this amazing book about Mont Saint-Michel. So there's kind of a part of old Europe that really appeals to them because it's kind of a world where everybody has a place and everybody knows their place.
And how does that sort of conflict with what's happening in America?
Not well. I mean, one of the points they tried to make in the book is that again, the entire family is anti-slavery, and Charles Francis Jr. does lead black cavalrymen during the war. But Dad, Charles Francis Sr., like John Quincy, they're aware of race, and they comment on it, but never in a very derogatory way. So Charles Francis Sr. in his diary would say, "Today I shared the stage with the colored man Douglas," or "Today I was at Faneuil Hall talking to the Negro Reman." But that's as bad as it gets. John Quincy II, Charles Francis Jr. use the N-word like they have Tourette's. And it's not just a racial thing, it's a class thing. What they say about Irish voters, what they say about Chinese and Chinese American workers in the West, who, by the way, Charles Francis employs when he's running the Union Pacific, is pretty much on par with what they say about former slaves as voters. So they're very much kind of out of tune with post-Civil War America, this kind of democratic style. So they come off as racist, but I think it's class as much as it is race.
Interesting. And so for them at the time, where are the interactions coming from? I mean, beside the military, that's a sort of direct throwing in this direct interaction between race and class. What other sort of instances were the Adamses sort of had to come down from on high to interact with regular folks?
Well, they don't very much. And they remain very much kind of people of their class. Henry moves to Washington and very much hopes that by writing about politics, both in novels, histories, essays, and newspapers, that he'll be tapped to become a senator. And he's actually the only one of that generation who really seems to aspire to political office, and in part because Charles Francis Sr. never becomes the third President Adams. The pressure is kind of off on the fourth generation. The eldest male, and usually the eldest male is the one who's tapped to be the next senator, governor, whatever, is John Quincy II. He's the one who lives in the big house out in Quincy. He loves planting trees. There's no trees there that are like the descendants of the trees he planted. He's supposed to be a gentleman farmer and be left alone, and that's not okay for an Adams. So his father, Charles Francis, writes and says, "You've got to run for something. Like just sitting in your front porch planting trees is okay for other people, but not for an Adams." But he runs as a Democrat. He's a conservative, and so he can't get elected in Massachusetts. So to a certain extent, most of the fourth generation don't really have to deal much with the public. Charles Francis Jr. becomes a railroad baron, and of course they all marry very well financially. So they don't really have to do anything. And most of them actually don't have what you and I would regard as a job.
And now, as a historian, is this sort of frustrating? Like, I'm trying to get a sense of what it's like, sort of adopting this family, as one might have to do for a biography. You mentioned it got a little tiring. It just sounds like an exercise in frustration.
Well, again, just they were not pleasant to each other. I mean, here's another story. So Henry finally marries. There's a woman named Marion Hooper. It goes by the name of Clover. And they actually seem to be kind of a mirror image of each other. They're both sort of a little quirky, a little eccentric. The brother, Charles Francis, just can't stand her and writes just really, really critical things about her in his letters and his diaries. And she becomes a great amateur photographer. And so she's got a picture of the historian George Bancroft, this amazing shot, black and white, of course, the smoke kind of wafting up from the cigarette. And I think it's the Atlantic that wants to do a story on Bancroft. And it's also kind of a problem for Henry because Henry sees himself as being the American historian and not Bancroft. But they want to buy and use her photograph. And Henry says to Clover, we're Adamses. It's nice to have a hobby. But we don't sell things. That's kind of what the proletariat do. Actually sell things for money. And then he breaks a tooth and goes to the dentist. And while he's gone, she drinks photography fluid.
Oh,
45 minutes to die. And there's other things going on in her life that makes her suicidal. But I've always thought the fact that's how she chooses to go out was kind of a calculated goodbye to Henry. So things like that just, one of my good pals was reading the manuscript and a story named Don Wright. And Don wrote one point in the margin, I'm really not liking these people. And it's just that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. It seems so much of our media now in present, I'm sorry to take you out of the past, but in the present, we have this sort of fascination with political dynasties, whether it's the Netflix series on the Crown and the British royalty or the sort of infinite publications we have on the Kennedys. A sense that seems to appeal to a lot of people, this sort of like love to hate type press. Have you found that to be the case in presenting sort of the Adamses to audiences?
Yeah, I'll and again, what you can say for them, I don't need to be too negative because again, I dislike most of them on sort of a personal level. But again, I used to admire. They're brilliant. They're hardworking. Their politics were correct, anti-slavery, free soil. And whereas I'm not sure that today dynasties have the same kind of relevance. I mentioned a moment ago that I've got British in-laws, and you look at American politics in recent decades, and you have first George Bush Sr., then you have Bill Clinton, then you have George Bush Jr., and then you have Barack Obama, then you have Hillary Clinton, and this is sort of kind of these two families sort of dominating modern politics in a way, and of course had Hillary Clinton won, that would have been even more pronounced.
Right.
I saw recently an odd editorial saying, well, is it Don Jr.? I forget which son now has a new book out.
Right, Don Jr., yeah.
And someone said, well, maybe, he's the next to run for office. But they're not Adamses. Adamses were brilliant, Harvard, and that's not to denigrate the Clintons or the Bushes, but I'm not sure that I understand today why some Americans are still so interested in family dynasties. They often don't make a lot of sense.
So the Adamses are truly, would you go so far to say that they are sort of a historical anomaly then in that way? Like this sort of American political dynasty might not exist at a different time? Sure.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think in part because it goes back to the founding generation. Certainly the pressure internally has to be enormous. I'm sure there's a book out there on presidential children, and a lot of them have not turned out terribly well. And I can't imagine, the pressure of being, the son of Franklin Roosevelt, and you can't just get a job teaching history. You have to be really, really important. And for Charles Francis Sr., he's not the son of a president; he's the son and grandson of presidents, and he's the son of the grandson of a founding father. At one point, when Charles Francis Sr. gives a big lecture on 4th of July in Faneuil Hall, his father's still alive, John Quincy, and so John Quincy is sitting on the stage, and behind John Quincy is a bust of John Adams. And so being Adams in Boston, you just can't get away from that kind of thing. And whereas I think today probably, there's no pressure on A.B. Carter to run for the Senate. So I think that's part of it, is because they were the founders, or a handful of founders of the nation.
And now you've talked a little bit about sort of they had views that were expected or even maybe a little current with their day in terms of race and things like that. What about in terms of economics and the economy? How did the Adamses sort of view these changes that are happening in the late 1800s, approaching the Gilded Age?
That's a really funny and great question, because they take advantage of it while they criticize it. And so Charles Francis Jr. again comes back from the war. He's not sure what to do next, and he has several offers to go into law. He actually had been in the law briefly before the war, doing wills and things he just found incredibly mundane. He decides, well, railroads. Railroads are the coming thing in America. So he starts reading about railroads, writes some pamphlets and essays with the intention of making himself kind of the railroad guy that you go to. And finally then does get put on the State Corporation Commission, and finally ends up on the CEO of the Union Pacific. So he was forced out finally by Jay Gould in kind of a hostile takeover. So he does become this sort of benign robber baron. Yet they also criticize people who are kind of the nouveau riche. The John D. Rockefellers who don't come from wealth Harvard background. And so even as they're living in their mansions, and Charles Francis Jr. Consciously marries a woman, Minnie Ogden, whose father is one of the richest men in New England. He likes her too. He likes the fact that there they are sitting in the portraits of all of them, wearing their tuxedos, drinking their port, smoking their cigars, but also very critical that other people who have reached that same level are not the best men, not from the same kind of background. And one of the most disturbing parts of the book is that Henry loses a lot of money in the crash of 1893, the most serious depression before 1929, and decides he's going to blame Jews for it, and starts saying spectacularly anti-Semitic things. It's the fault of Jew capital. At one point, he writes to John Hay. John Hay was his old friend from the Civil War days. He had been one of Lincoln's secretaries, and at this point is actually Secretary of State under McKinley. Henry writes to his old pal John Hay and says, the biggest problem facing the world now are Jew capitalists. And Hay written back and says, basically, Henry, snap out of it. What's happened to you? So he's being sort of admonished by his own friends. So despite their money and power, they're critical of others who have money and power, who don't have the same kind of New England breeding and background.
And so how valuable is it then to categorize, to link these people as siblings? I mean, we're all tied to our family, obviously, at some level, but how useful is it for you looking back at this study you've done?
Well, that's also a good question. I'm not really sure I've got a great answer on that, because the fourth generation, they really don't like each other very much. Charles Francis likes John Quincy, who's his older brother. But late in life, he dies right before Henry, and Henry writes to an old friend and says, Charles and I were racing for the grave, and Charles got there first. And he said, but we really haven't been close in decades, and we get together once a month and have dinner. We kind of look at each other and not say much. Families obviously can be kind of odd things. And certainly the fourth generation, none of them were kind of really close with each other. But the one time they would all pull together is if somebody criticized one of them. So they can pick on each other, and including say things in public about each other. But the second then somebody else says something about one of them, they circle the wagons. And so there is this kind of family dynamic there, although maybe that simply is because they are at Adams to criticize Henry, in Charles's mind is to criticize him as well. And I'm probably not a good enough psychiatrist to kind of puzzle that one out.
It sounds like you do have to have that sort of double skill when you're looking into these people's diaries. How much did you sort of trust them as you were going through? Did you find inconsistencies with events that were happening outside of the diary?
Not too much. And one of their virtues is they're as tough on themselves as they are on everybody else. So their diaries and their Charles Francis Jr., Henry, of course, published both their autobiographies, Education of, kind of a strange autobiography. They're really self-critical, and maybe that's an old New England Calvinist kind of thing. You sort of really delve into your soul. But they say things about themselves in their diaries. And again, poor George Washington, the alcoholic, is the worst in this. But they're not puffing themselves in their own work at the cost of everyone else. So I didn't really find any examples where they kind of build themselves up in their own writings at the cost of somebody else. And listeners, I find interesting. The one person that Charles Francis never understands is Lincoln. He, of course, is a Seward man, and like a lot of people in the Northeast, when Seward loses the nomination in '60 to Lincoln, Charles just regards this as a major debacle, and meets Lincoln on several occasions, and just doesn't get him. And he reads the Gettysburg Address. Of course, he's in England, so he reads the paper. And Henry does get it. Of course, Henry's the wordsmith. Henry's the writer. And Henry says this is a work of genius. He redefined America, redefined the war, in 5 minutes. And Charles says that it's really not very good, and I'll bet Seward wrote the good words. So he never gets so maybe that's not the one thing that's inconsistent, but it is kind of funny that he just never grasps Lincoln's greatness and never grasps Lincoln as a as the writer of great words.
So in the reverse, as the United States is sort of shifting west in some ways, and political geography is shifting, are the Adams, despite their global span, still deeply rooted in New England?
Yeah, and Henry, of course, is the one who lives most of his later life in Washington, D.C. But the rest stay up in the Boston area again. John Quincy and Brooks kind of take turns living in the big house in Quincy. The one who's kind of normal in that generation is the youngest daughter. There's two daughters in that generation, Louisa and Mary. And Mary's sort of the baby of the family. And her mother, Abigail Brown Brooks Adams. This is confusing. There's basically an Abigail every generation. So Charles Francis's wife was Abigail Brown Brooks Adams. It's tapped her to be her lifetime companion, and of course it will kind of care for her in her old age, in part because Abigail and Charles Francis don't get along very well. And so kind of later in life she marries. And her father's thrilled, her mother's distraught. But moves like 4 blocks down the road in Quincy, and so they all kind of stay in that one area except for Henry. So they remain New Englanders, and they do go out west. And Henry, after the death of Clover, travels the globe, and he's literally circumnavigates the world. He goes to Tahiti, but they always come back. They always come back to New England.
And do you see that as sort of a regional New England feature, or is that going back more? One thing that I'm very interested in is the Calvinism and the sort of the Christian sort of roots of this New England area. Is it the religion? Is it the region? Do you see the religion as playing that big of a role?
The religion plays a role only in terms of culture. The fourth generation are not religious in kind of a conventional sense, and Charles Francis Sr. is. Drags the entire family, including a reluctant Abigail, to 2 services every Sunday, and in his boy diary, Charles Francis says it was hated Sundays. We had to go to church twice and come back there to talk about, as a group, what the minister had to say. It says something like, other kids look forward to the weekend because they have the time off. He said, I dread the weekend because it means this kind of long day in church. So none of the kids are religious in kind of conventional sense the way Dad is, but they're culturally religious, and certainly Henry's attraction to cathedrals, the Middle Ages is kind of not a spiritual attachment, but a way of thinking about a world that was kind of conventionally faithful. Everyone sort of knew their place. So I think they're just comfortable and at home with New England culture. But I don't believe that Charles Francis Jr. As an adult ever belongs to a church.
And So, do you think this work and all these sort of paths that you've charted within this family, what do you think it's going to do for future historians looking at the Adams, both at the Adams that are before your story and kind of, Charles Francis or Henry or
Right.
the ones that are mentioned in your story?
Well, I'm not going to do it, but I mean,
Hmm.
there's a book that could easily pick up where I leave off, and I get through that. That blog has the death of the fourth generation. Um, and certainly the 20th century Adamses don't have the same kind of influence that the 19th century Adamses do. One of them serves Secretary of the Navy under Hoover. Um, they essentially kind of go into sort of private benevolence in the 20th century, and they still are members of the Mass Historical Society. They still are donors to Harvard. Um, and one of the fifth generation does drink himself to death. He's actually the coach of the Harvard football team. Dies very young of alcoholism. So one could write a kind of interesting, fifth and sixth generational story. I'm not the one to do it. I'm done with the Adams. But I think, just in terms of taking people who are collectively important and then telling their story against the story of the nation, country they change, country changes them, is kind of interesting sort of experiment. And it's usually not done. And I think the Adams has made it easy to do that because there's so many of them. They were so influential. But when we're talking about the connection to New England spirituality, people often, I think, kind of divorce their subjects from that kind of context, and that's probably not wise to do so.
Interesting. Now, you have this sort of phrase at the end where you call them an unsolved family. And so there is this sort of sense of incompletion. This is also a theme that, runs through a lot of American history as the, United States is kind of being unsolved.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about that sense of uncomfortability that's still there after you mentioned earlier that you were given a lot of space?
Right, sure. And that phrase came from the fact that late in life, Brooks, Henry, and Charles Francis are writing back and forth, kind of ruminating about the place of their family in American history, and they get into a conversation as to why Charles Francis Sr. never became the president. And I think it's Charles Jr. who says, "Well, I'm pretty sure he wanted to be president, but they don't even know for sure." And we're not really sure why he didn't become president. Why he didn't try hard enough to become president. So they can't kind of really puzzle each other out. They can't puzzle out their parents. And then what they mean as people who are now increasingly obscure by comparison to their ancestors. And it's Henry, Brooks, later life, who says, the first two generations, that was really the important part of the family. He says, we are appendages only, which is a very sort of odd way to think about your own generation's success or failure. And so I think to kind of puzzle out, what your responsibilities are. I was giving a talk recently in Boston, and I was kind of picking on fourth generation for cashing in and not getting involved in public service. And a person in the audience had a very good point. They said, well, is that really their responsibility? There's a wonderful famous John Adams quote about how he practices diplomacy in war, so his children can practice statecraft, and so his grandchildren can practice the arts. And the person said, so basically, isn't that what the fourth generation is doing? I mean, America has been established, and now they don't have to run for office and serve their nation. They can now kind of put money in their own pocket. I said, it's probably unfair for me to criticize them for not following the same kind of career public service that the first and second generation do. I said, but I think there is a responsibility when you have those kinds of benefits. You're sitting on a lot of money. You're brilliant. You have the virtues of a first-class education in a time in which most Americans have maybe been one state over from where they were born. This is a family that's been, literally, in the case of Henry, around the globe. And so I think there was kind of a responsibility there they chose not to pursue, and maybe that's maybe that is unfair, but most of us in life don't come from the same kind of place they did.
Right. And I think there's this temptation, especially in the sort of age of self-promotion and ego and those kind of things, that everyone kind of imagines or thinks of themselves as like from this great lineage. These people actually were from, a political nobility, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
It doesn't turn out to be all it's cracked up to be, I guess, right? Or do you have a positive story of finding peace?
Man, give me a few minutes. Because again, there is this pressure, and maybe I need to be more sort of understanding of that each generation puts on the next. That you can't just, again, in the case of John Quincy II, be a gentleman farmer and plant trees. You have to do something greater than that. I think there's something liberating in not following the same, kind of line of work as one's parents. So you can sort of chart your own course and succeed or fail in your own way. But none of them, possible exception of Mary Gardner, the kind of one normal daughter. They're all fairly unhappy. And at one point, Charles Francis Jr. is writing to Henry, and he says, nothing tells like being disagreeable. By which he means he thinks it's okay. So he's aware of the fact that he's not a pleasant person, and he makes no attempt to fix that. He marries Minnie in part because she's so charming. He writes to his father and says, she'll balance me out because she's just lovely and sweet and friendly, and I'm just kind of grouchy and difficult, and not that I'm aware of those things, and maybe I could try to change a little bit, but simply, no, that she's the kind of my counterpart, because she'll be the one who is pleasant and fun at parties, and I'll be the one kind of glaring at everybody. None of them seem to die happy or content. That's sad.
Yeah, and one thing I've heard from people who have worked on biographies that I've talked to say, especially with living subjects is a bit different, but people who have written biographies of people who have already passed, they say, there is this sort of sense of judgment. You're writing about someone's life, and this is what historians do. You were writing about people's lives. You are also writing about historians' lives, so they might be the harshest critics. How do you think the Adams would view your work?
I probably agree with it. Again, only because they're very self-critical. And again, I've read about people in the past who are complicated. And so, again, what I found odd about writing about them is, you write a book on John C. Calhoun or Jefferson Davis, and they do bad things. They're pro-slavery. Or you write on somebody who's really wonderful, Mohandas Gandhi. So here's a family again that had all these virtues, but just their kind of sheer meanness toward each other, toward the world. Sort of made it hard for me to write about them in maybe a more kind of objective way. I think every biographer worries, if Lincoln come back from the dead, what do you think about this? I can see Lincoln say, "But that's not what I meant." That speech. That's not exactly the plan that we had at the big convention in Chicago in 1860. But I mean, most of the things that I have in the book about them being nasty to each other, these are quotations. I'm not reading much into that. I'm simply allowing them to kind of speak. And so they might not like it if they can read the book. And there are descendants today. I'd be interested to hear from them. But when they are nasty to one another, I give them the quotes.
And that's what makes it fun to read. You've mentioned a little bit about sort of some audience questions or audience concerns as you're promoting throughout. You just talked about what the Adams might think. What has been the critical reception? Certainly, people feel a kind of ownership of Adams and Jefferson and Washington as if it were their own family. So can you share a little bit about how what you've heard?
Yeah, there's the book's only been out about a month, so the first reviews are fairly few in number. They've mostly been very nice, which is lovely. And in fact, when I spoke a few weeks ago, I spoke at the Boston Athenaeum, and there in the back of the room are busts of John Quincy and John. So I'm speaking about the Adamses, and they're there looking at me. Then I spoke that night at, what was the venue? And Charles Francis, it was the Union Club. And Charles Francis Jr. was one of the founders. So when I talk to those people, yeah, they are very kind of proprietary toward the Adamses. The one review I got recently that I thought was a little strange, and probably I should say here that wise historians don't read their reviews, but I did. And it was a person who also was very, very attached to the Adams family, and I looked him up. And he has a number of children, but two of them were named John and Abigail. I thought, well, John's not an unusual name, but we have kids named John and Abigail. That may be something. But the point he had, and a somewhat negative review, is that when I talk about the anti-Semitism of Henry or the racism of John Quincy II and Charles Francis Jr., he said, well, a lot of Americans in the 19th century had the same kind of attitudes. A lot of Americans used the same N-word. That John Quincy II routinely does. But what I try to kind of put out in the book is that there's real regression here. That the family, of course, is always aware of race, class, their prerogative in the world, their education. But the nastiness that I found in the fourth generation toward Black voters, toward Irish voters, toward Chinese and Chinese American workers, that was missing in the earlier generation. So there's, what's actually when John Quincy and Charles would use the N-word, which they use consistently in their correspondence. It's to each other. So when Charles Francis Jr. leading Black men into battle, writes to his father, he uses the word Negro. So he even understands he's got to kind of pull his punches when it comes to talking to Dad. So again, the point I'm trying to make here is that for the fourth generation, there's kind of a real step back, and people who are really uncomfortable with the world. And late in life, after he's fired from the Union Pacific, Charles Francis Jr. Gives speeches all across the South, and his topic is Robert E. Lee. And the standard opening line is, Robert E. Lee was a great man. And he advocates for a Lee statue. I mean, here today talking about removing statues, he advocates a Lee statue, not in Richmond, but in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And gives a talk to William and Mary, and at that point, the president is a Tyler, the son of John Tyler, who opens his remarks by saying, we here in Virginia would love to have this man as the next President Adams, because he sees the world we do. So they really turn on Reconstruction. And so this is not consistent with earlier generations of the family. And of course, John Quincy Sr., the first, goes to the Supreme Court to fight for the Amistad captives. And so the fourth generation kind of really turn on earlier generations when it comes to those kinds of issues.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear back, and you're right. I think it's good advice. Don't check your reviews, but I think it's also just so important to engage with the audience, no matter how wherever they're coming from, and I think you respect that as someone who's been teaching the next generation of historians. So unfortunately, we're getting towards the end here, but fortunately, we're getting to the suggestion. So, Doug, what would you suggest to our Hour of History podcast listeners?
Well, one of the things that made me want to do this book is, of course, because they do become presidents. John and John Quincy get all the attention in the last 5 years or so. There's been two big fat biographies of John Quincy Adams, but recently, good friends of mine, Andy Burstein and Nancy Eisenberg, who both teach at Louisiana State. They write a lot of books together. I wrote a great book about the presidencies of John and John Quincy called The Problem of Democracy. It's a wonderful book, a wonderful read. And all strange things. I was here at Syracuse at Barnes & Noble this week buying Christmas gifts, and they're on the shelf next to each other was my book and Andy and Nancy's book. So buy my book first. Buy their book second. You'll like it a lot. It's a great book, The Problem of Democracy.
That's a great suggestion. And of course, at hourofhistory.com, we have a link to these great books. As an LSU alum, I'm glad to hear that suggestion.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and my suggestion is somewhat along these lines. Of course, I suggest you read great history books, and we have links at hourofhistory.com. My suggestion is that you take advantage of the next few weeks and talk to your family. Try to find out if there's any archives in your own house, and I think you might, if you're daring enough, you might find some interesting stuff and some interesting stories, and you can parallel it with sort of the U.S. history, like Doug has done in such a compelling way. Before we sign off, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, just great to talk to you, and fantastic to talk about my book, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. The book, Heirs of an Honored Name, The Decline of the Addams Family and the Rise of Modern America. It's a fascinating book with a ton of great stories. You just heard a sampling of them here today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.